if people were incests in the Bible, like Abraham with his half sister Sarah in the Old Testament, was it supported in the New Testament and in this modern age? Is it biblically supported also? All right, so we see, from what the Bible describes, especially in the Old Testament, there were incestuous relationship. For example, the relationship between Adam's children, right? So if, because Adam gave birth to Cain and Abel and Seth and other daughters that were not named, right? And the logical way that humanity would have expanded was if Cain, Abel, Seth, well, Abel died, but Cain and Seth and other children had fellowship with one another, right? And then going on again to other parts, like for example, when we come to Noah's family were the surviving family after the flood, so they had to fellowship and coitus with one another to to what's it called, populate the earth, but otherwise they would have not had population, right? We could say that they're already married because some of Noah's children had wives already. So red marriage, could that be incest, or could it be cousins and cousins incestuous? That's another conversation on what qualifies as incest. But what we can agree that is largely the mainstream of what qualifies as incest. Will be another example would be other things that happened in, for example, Abraham with his half sister Sarah, because Abraham and Sarah had a the same parents. Well, not both parents, right? I think they had, they had the same, they shared one parent, even though the other parents were different. Right. So Abraham with half sister, there were other things that were described like that were incestuous in the Bible. Does that mean that incest was the plan of God, or is morally justified, or God is, as I saw online recently, that God is pro-incest? Um, First of all, our conclusion cannot be that God is pro-incest, especially when the Lord commanded, contrary to incest in Leviticus, right? That a man, giving of the law, that a man must not approach his close kin. So father, mother, brother, sister, half brother, half sister, somebody very closely related to you must not approach that person for sexual intercourse or for sexual engagement. All right. So that devil is a liar. Something just flashed my mind. So, we cannot say that God is pro incest when he clearly forbid incest in scripture. So there were now things that we can now say, okay, well, if God now gave the law that contradicts incest, why there was now, this setting that the Lord allowed incest to happen, that he allowed incest to happen in his plan, right? Because there's this idea that they they were they were the only ones who were there, only the human beings on earth for Adam and his family, Adam, Eve, and their children. All right, they were the only true family on earth, so they had to intercourse with one another to populate the earth. And so God allowed that, God designed creating a system to allow that. Would mean that God thought it was moral, God was pro-incest, not necessarily. And why we can't outrightly say that it's necessary, because in the Old Testament, at the giving of the law, it was condemned, right? And that going on in there are examples like that also in the New that we can. I think that we can, yeah. I'll just go on. Excuse me, but in coming to, we can also have the arguments also in the New Testament from things that we see there, right? because there was an issue in 1 Corinthians 5. We had that Apostle Paul was condemning somebody sleeping with his father's wife. Even though we can say, oh, that is fornication and adultery on his father's wife part, but he said this is not even mentioned among the Gentiles, meaning connoting a moral undertone or an immoral undertone for the act altogether. Okay, so so we can't say that God was pro-incest. So there were now some things that happened during the time of Adam and possibly Noah, but Noah's children and wives, but possibly Noah. This is not me saying that again, that's a different conversation that we would have. But yeah, if they were cousins, it's too closely related, so we can't say that, under that framework. But possibly Noah's family, Adam and Sarah. Now we can say that number one, right, is that these were the times that the Lord had not given the law yet, right? And so at that time there was no understanding that what they were like, these things was prohibited, because until the law, as Romans said, until the law, sin was in the world, but sin was not imputed. Okay. So it was kind of a design that the Lord had in place. That doesn't mean that the Lord permitted it. I'm sorry, it doesn't mean that the Lord prescribed it. So we can't say it was pro-incest. But there was a system in place before the law that sin was not imputed, as Romans shows us. But also that there were times that it was just it was inevitable and necessary. For example, Adam's family, right? They were the first. They were the only family, first family on earth. So there was no other way to populate the earth as God has instructed. So it was contextually necessary at that time. And yeah, it was done. Does that make it moral? No. Why? Because we see it condemned eventually when the law was revealed, because the law came to show us how we had fallen. They were already falling, and the law came to show us how much more we had fallen, right? How we had fallen from God, and showed us the difference between us and God. And there's entire conversation in that regard, right? And yeah, it was contextually necessary. Doesn't make it moral, right? And there's a whole, we can argue, right, that all of these things can be as a consequence of the fall. That people say, oh, God designed, it was God's design. No, but all of these things happened after the fall. So the things that God might probably have done before the fall could have been way different. Okay. So all of these things happened after the fall. They were sending out of Garden of Eden, and it was after them that they had Cain and Abel. So there could have been a whole different story before the fall. And if this was before, they were falling already, and it's some things that the Lord was allowed during the fall for God's will to be done. Does not make it moral, but it was permitted. It was allowed. It was permitted. Is that a word? But the Lord allowed it, and then when he came to the fact, so all of the things that we mentioned, right? Abraham, all of the people that I mentioned already, they were before before Abraham made them, they were before the law was, and so the law came to show us that yes, that thing is wrong. Go stop it, right? So it doesn't make incest moral because it was necessary. It was contextually necessary at that time. It doesn't, right? It's a different ball game because they were already falling. They were outside of the garden. They were falling. So that was a consequence of that. We can argue. And the natural consequence or necessity, a contextual necessity for that period as well, is that they come together, even though they are closely related, to populate the earth. And so that's a thing. That doesn't make it moral, right? And yeah, so the law, because when we now come to the law came to show us God and to show us morals. Yeah, there were ceremonial laws, there were sacrificial laws, but a lot of other laws were moral laws, right? And we can see this even, we can argue that this is even enforced even also in the New Testament. And you know, so that could be one thing. And there could also be, the necessity, because there were necessary things in the law that the Lord gave as laws to the children of Israel in the Old Testament, Leviticus and Deuteronomy, that were in Exodus even, that the Lord was giving, and we can today, right, can be said to be safe examples, safe practices to save us. Otherwise, people would just be dying left and right, or there would have been a lot of harm done to humanity. For example, we can see that when we come to the conversation on what circumcision is healthy, right? As science shows today, is healthy for males, right? So circumcision has its benefits, and God prescribed this right from Abraham, right? But so there's also a conversation. There's another scientific study on the problems of people who are closely related, so brothers and sisters having sex to give birth to children. There'll be genetic problems, right? Um, and this is something that we can look up, right? People coming together that are very closely related will give birth to offspring that are not so viable. There could be complications, right? And this was probably one thing that, because if the children of Israel were doing it en masse, the children of Israel could be wiped out. So God giving laws were also for our good. Anything that God instructs is for our good. So we can argue from that point as well, right? Of incestual um relations, or incestuous relations, being outlawed. We can argue from that point as well. And concerning, whether in the Old Testament, the New Testament, or in today, can it be supported? Well, there was no point in scriptures that it was encouraged, except for it was described, right, as the things that happened, or implied as the things that happened, especially with Adam and Adam's children, rather, with Noah's children, with Abraham. It was described as things that happened, but that does not mean that was what was prescribed, and there was no place in scripture that it was actually prescribed. Contrary to that, it was a lot of times where it was, aside from where it was described alone, there were other parts that was described, but it was also always in a negative light. For example, when describing what happened with Lot and his daughter, so Lot was drunk, he did not have a son. His daughters were like, "Oh, we don't have a man, and our father's name will just perish like that. Let's sleep with our father." So the people can say they slept with him while he was drunk. And it was, when you read that account, right, it is really um usually being connoted, right, with an idea of shame, of what was not okay. All right. So it is what's it called? It is wrong, right? The language or the tone of the story shows or connotes the idea that that type of sexual relationship was wrong, right? We can also, Amnon slept with his half sister Tamar. Amnon was the son of David, who had feelings for um his half sister Tamar and raped her. But this story in the Bible was also told in a negative light. So it can't be said that it was prescribed or is supported, because there was no prescription or any tone of support for it. Other places were descriptions, and other places there were necessary contextual necessity or necessary consequence of some of the things after the fall. They were to populate the earth anyway, and it was fulfilling God's plan because then populating the earth to give birth to, all the people that came after Abraham, and consequently Jesus Christ. So yeah, can can we say that, can the Bible be interpreted, or can we look at the Bible as it is intended to say that it is implicitly or even explicitly encouraging incestuous relationships? No. It's supported even in the New Testament. First Corinthians 5 shows us otherwise, right? Because Apostle Paul was like, this person sleeping with his father's wife. Well, yeah, it was bad fornication on the single man's part if he was single, adultery on the father's wife's part. But he also mentioned that such a thing is even mentioned among the Gentiles, saying that this is bad also, that this close relationship is not even mentioned among Gentiles. So we can infer that it was the incestuous nature of the sin, of the problem, that he had a big problem with. He had a big problem with the sin in and of itself. So let's not conflate what I meant. All right, so I don't know if that did justice to the question. I hope it did. Incest is not supported. That's the long and short. That's the long and short of it.